The following is a recording of the Q&A discussion with Dr. Finn MacKay and Dr. Tom O'Shea from the first evening of Leeds Love Month 2003 on the topic of attraction and dating. Leeds Love Month was organised by the Centre for Love, Sex and Relationships at the University of Leeds, and we hope to improve relationships by studying intimacy. You can follow the Centre on social media for news of future events and publications. The talk series was generously funded by the Society for Applied Philosophy. We had two really interesting talks. They were both quite different and they both connect to each other in a variety of ways. And hopefully over this kind of next hour, we can tease out some of those connections. And I also want to really learn from all of you and see what you have to say about this with the first question. Okay, so we have someone here.
Hello. Thank you so much for the talk so far. Thoroughly enjoying it. So more of a comment rather than a question. Particularly when it comes to dating preference. A lot of people would like to see dating preferences very much personal, but that's not strictly true. That filters into your social life and your professional life as well. We all heard about pretty privilege and people who are perceived as more attractive and more on average across a lifetime. And also men who are above 6 foot are overrepresented in terms of boards of CEOs and Fortune 500 companies. So the fallacy that what you like in your personal life has no bearing on your hiring choices or the people you choose to have as friends is not strictly true at all.
Okay, brilliant. Do either of you want to comment? Defend us short kings over here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And you can sort of see that as, you know, one of the worries for the view that I've kind of set out, that, look, there might be these issues to do with justice, is that, you know, do you want to say really that there are kind of fundamental issues of justice, you know, because someone's kind of a bit shorter and therefore they're disadvantaged for that? Like, is it only these big identity categories like disability or race or perhaps class where it's salient? I'm not entirely sure what I think about that issue, but philosophers recently have been very exercised about it. I mean, they talk about lookism. On an analogy with these other forms of kind of discrimination. That's a bit too rich for my blood. I'm not so convinced that those are quite as serious, because you think in the cases of disability, and at least in certain examples of kind of racial aversion, what seems so pernicious about it is that they're compounding other forms of kind of very long-standing injustice, which has this historical dimension, where it's at least plausible in some of these cases to say that people are already second-class citizens, and then they're having this extra thing on top of that. They're having this sort of treatment where they're excluded from intimacy, they're excluded from relationships, and therefore they're excluded from all of the kind of psychological and social and economic benefits of that. So that leads me to think that maybe there is a difference between this either lookism or, you know, tallism, if you want to call it that, or shortism, and these other cases. But I'm still wrangling with that, and it's a topic that often comes up when I talk to people about this. You know, how far do you want to push this? So yeah, it's the open question, I think. So thank you.
This is such a sensitive topic to discuss. I have never been in such a talk before. So I have to also articulate my question carefully, not to offend anyone. So what I wanted to ask was, is it very important to be flexible in finding a partner? Is it important to be flexible than not being flexible? Then how much one should be flexible is? And does it change over time? Because I think it changes over time, people's set of preferences. Maybe depending on a given situation, maybe how they are looking, or maybe what their age is. Maybe they are not so they are choosy, but later on they extend their set of preferences. So if that is the case, then how we would say that the love or whatever attraction has to be natural, then it becomes very objective. We have to be analytical about it. We have to plan it. So that's where I was thinking. So what would you have to say on that?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. Flexibility. Does anyone have thoughts?
I think that's true. I mean, you might think about this. Well, how are we thinking about desirability? Is it both from the person who's desired? Is that over a whole lifetime, or is it like a particular periods in people's life, and again for the desirer themselves? Like, I think there are also these sort of wider questions about. Particularly when it comes to kind of issues of kind of race and racialization, that whether in some senses, it's important at all. So Russell Robinson, who is a kind of a lawyer and a philosopher, has talked about these cases where we might think there's what he calls an anti-subordination norm going on. So that in some cases, maybe some people don't have an obligation to be kind of open to anyone who comes along because of their experiences, and perhaps their experiences of certain forms of injustice. So he talks about relationships in which there's been persistent racial friction between the partners. So that he's thinking about cases of kind of black Americans who have been in interracial relationships and have just had a miserable time because they're dealing with all these kind of microaggressions from people, like just these little things that kind of build up. And he says that those people, they don't need to be flexible. Like, they've given it a fair shake. They've given it a go, and it hasn't worked out for them. So let's not worry too much about kind of people who are already sort of kind of suffering in this respect. That they don't necessarily need to be kind of super open to the world because they've given it a go and they've come off badly from it. So that might be a limit on the flexibility and who we might expect to be a bit more flexible, precisely because of these histories of injustice.
I agree, and I think it is a really kind of basic question, isn't it? But I think the idea that our desires, which do feel, of course, so intimate and personal and individual, and also we do often think of them as long-standing parts of our self. We don't really think of them as having a beginning point. Like when I talk with students about this, as I said in my presentation, they'll use words like, well, I've always been different to my brother in these ways, or, well, I just always fancied these kind of people. Well, you didn't always, did you? Like, not when you were a baby. They started at a particular time, but then we can know it's hard to sort of pinpoint, those starting points. But the idea that our desires and our ideas about what is attractive, so hierarchies of attractiveness, would not be shaped by our society and culture, I think is bizarre. Of course, it's shaped and informed and constructed by our society and by hierarchies and norms within our society. That doesn't mean you can go down to the level of the individual and in a really rapey way sort of say, well, you need to start dating this kind of person, because we're going to share out, all these people. That would not be okay. But does it mean that we should step back and look at the level of society and think, well, how are we representing people, as sexual, as desirable, as attractive? That is important. What does power look like in our society? Who is at the top of mainstream powerful institutions? Who is at the top of powerful positions in the media? Who is presented as powerful and wealthy and desirable? And we can change those things. We can start to change those things over time. And I think with that, people's desires and ideas about attractiveness would change. And maybe, sooner rather than later, we should certainly start to do more to challenge sort of what is blatant racism and disableism and homophobia that's out there. Absolutely. We could also start doing that now.
Can I just pick up on something you said? So I'm really interested in this idea of the emphasis on always. I've always been X, I've always been Y. So do you think that people feel they need to say that in order for their claims to have validity, right? So if we had a sort of more relaxed social attitude towards people's identities, their sexuality, their preferences, and if we thought that it doesn't matter if it's a phase, right? Like, who cares? It's still as valid and interesting and important and significant than if you've always felt this way. So is there kind of an underlying pressure towards this idea that things are only valuable if they've always been that way? And so people just, they narrate their own histories. They have to narrate them as being always this, always that. It's not true. And does that kind of speak to your research? So a lot of the examples you gave seemed of people that it's almost like they felt this narrative pressure towards permanence of identity. I've always been this person. Like, is it a social issue?
Yes, I think it is. There is a justification, and it's interesting that justification comes from people who want to be seen and read as an identity that society has denied to them or might not routinely see them and identify them as. So people that are, trans or transgender identified, for example. But then also with heterosexual orientated people, students that I work with on these topics, they would also say, as a form of justification, but they're not coming from a minoritized group and they're not coming from an identity that hasn't been seen or read. They're coming from a dominant identity, but still, yes, they would narrate it with this perhaps coming from a slightly different place, but nevertheless still a form of sort of further foundation or concretizing their identity maybe, or as further proof, and maybe also as justification for why they haven't thought of or entertained the idea of a different identity.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So I've got a written question that I want to read out, selfishly because it relates to a question I was going to ask if I had to ask one as a kind of emergency question, right? So the question goes like this. Do you think that dating life would be better if labels such as butch, lesbian, and various racial labels didn't exist, or are they helpful? Do labels get in the way of really seeing or getting to know the person? Or are labels the gateway of attraction? And the way I wanted to kind of explore this thought was to try and connect the two things that you were saying in your different talks. Because there seemed to me a kind of core tension, right? So Finn described people who really took value in generating labels for themselves, finding ways to express their identity, a kind of self-determination. And often they were kind of scrabbling together to find words and fixing them together to label themselves. And it seemed that Tom was sort of saying, well, maybe the kind of categories and filters we're using on dating apps allow us to be discriminating in a way that is propagating injustice. And one thought we might have from that is that we should kind of back away from those filters and labels. So a question to kind of both of you, which really lies with this question from the audience, thank you, is do you think there's a kind of a real fundamental tension between the use of labels to express ourselves and to determine who we are, on the one hand, and the need to be responsible when trying to date and kind of act on our attractions to people on the other hand? And more concretely, if you were sort of designing a dating app, what would you allow people to say about themselves? Like, how fine-grained do you think we should go? Do some people get to say more than others? Does it matter if you're in a dominant identity or a subordinate one? I'm just really curious to know what you both think about that issue.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So I'm not sure that the problem is necessarily labels per se. So I think it's good that people have like a really rich vocabulary for kind of describing their kind of experience of the world, their place within it, that they can kind of narrate these things with a sort of high level of kind of sophistication and so on. I mean, I wonder whether there's a more sort of kind of radical trajectory to some of this in terms of what might a sort of particularly attractive form of kind of dating and romantic life look like. I mean, I'm sort of quite drawn when it comes to, say, issues of gender, for example, towards a kind of abolitionist kind of view of kind of gender. So it's not necessarily that the problem is people are using these labels and the labels are getting in the way. It's that kind of gender is often kind of a form of kind of oppression itself, in the way in which you might think disability is baked into it as a form of oppression, or class baked into it as a form of oppression. And whether we could get to a point where our dating lives were beyond the labels of kind of men and women, or they were beyond kind of racial kind of categories, not because we decided to be kind of difference-blind liberals and say like, oh, I don't care about any of that. I'm so above these kind of categories. I don't see race. I don't see gender. I don't see these things. But more that we sort of break down certain forms of kind of group differentiation, which are which are kind of associated with kind of forms of oppression in the first place, in the same way in which, it's the goal of Marxist politics is not to ensure that, the working class are kind of well-fed and well-housed and so on. It's to destroy class. It's to destroy the working class as well as to destroy the kind of the upper class. And in a similar way, I wonder whether the ultimate horizon of this, the most radical horizon, is to try and destroy the categories themselves rather than just the words that we use about them, the self-narration. I mean, the self-narration is important. The labels are important.
Can I just push you and be mean then? So,
Yes.
Talking about Marxism is lovely, but if I gave you £1 million to develop a Marxist dating app
I'd take that
with input from someone like Sally Hanslanger, right, who's kind of moving towards a society in which gender doesn't exist in the way we think of it now. So, how would you design the app? I mean, a radical way you might do it is say, look, you can describe yourself however you like as long as you don't use gender terminology. Right? I mean, so you can be creative, you can use other, but certain ways of describing yourself are kind of prohibited. But how would you do this in practice?
Yeah, I think that's tough, but we can look to sort of experiences on kind of dating apps at the moment. So there's a kind of particular kind of controversy around people's self-narration on Grindr, for example, people using all sorts of kind of offensive kind of racial language to kind of exclude who they don't want to be with. No rice queens, for example, is a kind of a famous thing, which is sort of anti-Asian kind of form of kind of discrimination. And so you might think just in more quotidian ways about those sorts of policies, which is that's less about people describing themselves and their own identities and their own histories, but people describing their desires, who they're open to. It's vexed though, because maybe they're an important red flag, right? Maybe you want racists to announce themselves very vociferously, and the same with transphobes and so on, so that you don't sort of get into those get into those sort of bad sort of interactions. So I think there are ways in which the big kind of abstract sort of questions about how would you from scratch develop this sort of dating site, this sort of map onto some much more kind of local and immediate things which these companies are dealing with. What is our policy about the using of racialized language and talking about who we want and who we don't want? So I didn't answer your question, but I said some stuff related to it.
I wasn't expecting you to give your trade secrets away. Finn, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, on labels, I suppose I'd say I do think that being seen and recognised could be considered a human right. And I think what we've had is a situation where certain minoritized people have not been seen, have not been recognised, and have not had a name. Now we're going through a process of social change where people do have names and labels and are using those, and mainstream society is hearing them and using them, and people are using them to describe themselves to other people. And that social change, of course, has gone alongside a sort of narrative of erasure or scarcity from dominant groups who have long had names and labels, saying, oh, hang on, these groups getting their brand new names and labels must mean that you're taking recognition and names and labels away from us, the dominant group. And of course, it's never about that. It's just saying, well, hang on, for centuries, some of us have never been seen. Our families have not been recognised. Our desires did not exist officially or in any kind of media or positive cultural representation. We may not have been legally represented. We may not have been even legally recognised as in a partnership or as parents of children, for example. So that history does matter. And the fact that now those labels mean we can be seen and understood, we can have levels of legal protection, I think is a positive thing, even though we might all be aware of the critiques of never-ending and ever-decreasing circles of labels. I mean, how long do you keep on defining different parts of yourself? And I think your ideas, Tom, about gender abolition intersect again with a group you mentioned earlier, which would be the Leeds Revolutionary and Radical Feminists, who also looked forward to a time, a post-gender society, as did famous radical feminists of the 1960s and 70s, like Andrea Dworkin, like Kate Millett, who looked forward to a post-gender pansexual society where heterosexuality would no longer be a given in the way that it is. It would no longer be an assumed norm.
Okay, brilliant. Anyone else have a question that we've got a few, okay, brilliant.
So this question may feel like shooting fish in a barrel, but I think it could be worth spelling out anyway. What would you say were the main ills with masculinity when dating? So, for example, a lot of my friends who are girls may come back from a date and they'll say to me something like, "I just hate men." And I kind of wonder, what do they mean when they say that? Like, what are the main points that they're characterising when they're saying that they just hate men?
Okay, that's a good question. So we need to take some notes here. So what does it mean when people say that? Does anyone want to speak to that, maybe?
I think you're the masculinity expert, so you first.
Well, oh my goodness. I mean, we've got these buzzwords out there, haven't we, of toxic masculinity, which has become such a buzzword at the moment. It's a term that I don't actually use, that I critique. I think it's unhelpful. Going back to, what Tom was discussing, if we're going to look at gender itself, and the social and cultural norms and hierarchies that are within gender, not just masculinity, but femininity too, then we have to conclude that gender roles in themselves are problematic. So the idea of separating human beings up by gender is problematic. I mean, I don't really like the word toxic. I think it's so sort of emotive and loaded, but it's problematic. Gender is problematic in itself. So I don't really think that this idea of a form of masculinity that is particularly toxic is useful, because what it does is monsterize certain kinds of behaviours and sort of separate them off as if they're kind of bad apple, one-off behaviours. So the classic example given, of course, and we saw this during the Kavanaugh hearings in America, is Donald Trump as being a representative of a toxic masculinity. So it's a homophobic, sort of insecure, heterosexual, predatory, misogynistic and aggressive style of masculinity, which always needs to prove itself, not to women, interestingly, but to other men. And indeed, Andrea Dworkin describes patriarchy as a giant ladder of men competing with each other. And the damage that is done to women and children is an unfortunate side effect as far as they're concerned. But we can't overlook as well, the amount of damage and harm that is done to the minds and bodies and indeed lives of our boys and young men every day, who are disproportionately affected by violence from other men, whose bodies and lives are sacrificed to maintain this myth of the patriarchal construct of male invincibility. So I think gender in itself is toxic. Gender roles are toxic. So if we take that starting point, and we're also not biological essentialists, then we have to stop looking for some kind of positive or healthy version of masculinity. We could say, well, masculinity itself doesn't really exist. You've got human values, you've got social values, you've got ways of living together in a society, ways of being, and they shouldn't be separated out by sex. We shouldn't say, well, some of these values and ways of being are only for one sex and not for the other. You look at definitions of what masculinity is, and you can look at being able to defend yourself, being able to defend your family, being a breadwinner, being bold, being physically able, being competitive, honour, respect. These are not values and behaviours that belong to only men in society. Women show and behave and express all of these values as well. And I do think that a lot of the progressive and positive men's movements are somewhat held back in this search for a better kind of masculinity. The idea that we would have got the radicalism of the second wave women's liberation movement if feminists were sitting around saying, oh, the answer is a healthier kind of femininity. If we did femininities better, we'd be okay. The world, it's laughable. People are laughing here. Why are men not laughing when they talk that way about masculinity? But having said that, those men's groups, although they started during the 70s too, have not had the traction and hold and perhaps levels of organisation and social progress that the women's movement had. So in a way, perhaps they've still got a long way to go. But I think I'm avowedly anti-essentialist. I think, it was Andrea Dworkin who said that feminists are not feminists because they hate men. They're feminists because they believe in men's humanity against all evidence to the contrary. And let's not forget that Andrea Dworkin spent a lot of her adult life and all of her later years in a relationship with a man who she loved, John Stoltenberg, the gender scholar, although she, of course, importantly identified as a political lesbian. I think we have, and Bell Hook's book on this is very good, The Will to Change, on men, masculinity and love. Sorry, I could go on and on, but that kind of women are from Mars and men are from Venus language, it never goes away. Every year it has some sort of popular resurgence. It's essentialist. It separates human beings out by sex. I think it's unhelpful. I think the radical and much more radical stance to take is that we're all human beings and we have to learn how to be humane, and that's most important.
So that was great. I mean, my initial sort of response when these sorts of questions come up is to think, well, what's a bit of misandry between friends, right? You can understand the frustrations and so on. But, my longer answer is articulated much better by Finn is that one exactly.
Yeah, it's great to see such unanimous agreement between both of you. And thank you for the question. So we have some other questions in that area. Can you just pass the mic around?
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I wanted to ask if, say, the ideal dating app or kind of dating scenario was created where, gender was abolished, we're all, attraction might be based on, a very essential elements of someone's personhood or sense of self. Do you think it would ever be possible for who we date or who we're attracted to be based on freedom, the freedom that you get from that sort of equality and just thinking about personhood? Or do you think it will always be in a way determined by maybe labels that we use, or even unspoken ones that kind of grip people, let other people know what you like? So yeah, do you think that we could ever reach ultimate freedom, or will there always be a sort of determinism or fate in who you end up with?
So that's a good question. Can I just connect that to a question that someone passed me as well? So someone else wanted to ask this, or it was a thought that they had, which is, do we feel the need to identify with a group or identify a group that we're attracted to in order to feel a level of protection in society, right? So that speaks to this idea there might be these kind of motivations we have which we're not really aware of, which are kind of shaping our preferences. So do any of you have thoughts about that? The question seems to be, can we ever be free of these factors and social pressures which shape our preferences when dating and looking for relationships?
I think there are some sort of forms of kind of differentiation between people which are relatively sort of innocent. We talked about perhaps something like hair color. Maybe that's not completely innocent. That's kind of connected often to people's kind of background, their genetics, and so on. So there are forms of kind of differentiation there which might not be kind of purely personality based, or this sense that you're someone's soulmate in a way which kind of goes beyond any kind of physical dimension, any social positioning. So I think that there can be sort of relatively kind of innocent sort of forms of kind of attraction in that way, which might just seem kind of totally arbitrary, idiosyncratic, like bad luck if you don't have that trait, good luck if you do, given what people's sort of desires are. But I think on this sort of this kind of other question to do with it's almost people's legibility, right? That I think desire is a very kind of confusing when you're experiencing it. It can often not be this kind of, oh, this is a wonderful form of attraction. People can experience their desires as oppressive. They don't want them. Think back to Selena Gomez. What's that song about? The heart wants what it wants. Like, well, who does it want in that song? It wants someone that she knows is bad for her. So in that sense, there can be kind of pressures to kind of narrate yourself and to narrate your own desires in ways that maybe give some kind of fixity, some solidity to it. We're sort of, in a way, sort of running away from the kind of the freedom which we might think that we have, at least partially, to desire differently, or to be open to new people, to be open to new genders, to be open to people of different backgrounds, and so on. But I think there is the almost kind of existentialist kind of idea that people want to describe themselves in certain roles because that just makes it easier to navigate the world. There's a kind of flight from freedom there of saying, well, I am this is what I desire, I've always desired this, I will always desire this, and I couldn't desire anything different because it's in my nature, it's just who I am. Sometimes that might be true of some people. I think often it's not, and the desire to narrate yourself in a way almost like you're this impersonal machine or object. I think that's a sometimes a worrying kind of tendency. Even if for some people it might be true that they've always desired in a certain way, they always will.
Can I just ask you one thing about what you said? So you mentioned innocent desires, right? Like freckles or hair color, and you kind of reserve those as the things that are left over, right? Like maybe those things are okay. And I guess a critic might think, well, surely those are the easiest things to work on, right? Like they're so arbitrary and irrelevant. And if we're like really discriminating in terms of people's hair color or height or something, that's not great either, right? Like we should work on the easiest things first, or the most morally arbitrary first. And so if we're interested in kind of cultivating a more responsible approach to other people, should we also put the innocent things on the table as well and say, well, like it'd be really weird if I was going around saying, well, I'm not really discriminating against gender identity or racial background, but like if you are under this height, no chance. I mean, I'm obviously biased here, but it just seems like kind of a weird thing to end up saying, in a way.
Yeah, because I guess on the sorts of kind of trajectory of thought that I've kind of put out. Okay, well, what are the kind of legitimate things, like people's personality, the things that they've chosen, their interests? I mean, what is it that's at the kind of the heart of this, which seems like, oh, that's a good basis to decide who you want to have sex with, or who you want to be in a relationship with, and everything else is off the table. And so, yeah, I'm not really sure what I kind of think about some of these sort of claims, which are sort of then associated with kind of lookism. Like, this is just arbitrary things. So why should you rule someone out because of their height? Why should you rule someone in because they got freckles? Like, sure, that's even more morally stupid than to think about their class position in society or their gendered position and so on. So I'm not totally sure how to kind of make that distinction. It makes me think of I saw this paper a few years ago by a philosopher called Taina Thao, and she's interested in these kind of love drugs questions, where she thinks it would be great if we could just take some kind of drugs, and therefore we won't think about physicality at all. We could sort of we become disinhibited on that basis, and then it would all be about personality. And I sort of feel like there's a very sort of Christian history there, where it's all a kind of Cartesian split between the mind and the body, where what's really important is your immortal soul and the choices that you've made under the light of God or something, and that it's everything else is somehow illegitimate. And I thought, I hope people aren't understanding what I'm saying in that vein, which to me seems very weird, but I'm still not quite sure how to distinguish myself from that sort of quite strange kind of point towards a really kind of frictionless equality when it comes to romantic relationships.
I mean, that's a really interesting way of putting it. And like this question about freedom, again, it comes back to this tension between the talks between this issue of sort of self-determination and legibility on the one hand, and then this kind of possibility that we could somehow be free of desire and attraction on the other hand, and sort of have no labels appended to us or to other people. And I guess one thing for you to think about is which of those makes us more free. Finn, did you want to contribute?
The height thing's come up quite a few times. I'm normal heighted, so I'm a normal height, like yourself there. But I mean, that's so intrinsically linked to gender dynamics, to patriarchy. I mean, where does that come from? It comes from the idea that masculinity is defined by dominance, that the sort of core basis of heterosexual relationships and the heterosexual dynamic is a relationship of predator and prey. That's quite gross, isn't it? But I think if you look at a lot of the cultural representations of heterosexual relationships, the language that's used about heterosexual relationships, dating and sexual exchanges, even around ideas of consent, even supposedly progressive language. So I've seen campaigns for schools, for example, which are supposedly progressive, called things like "Give It, Get It," lessons about consent. Well, I'm sure if you went to the person in the street and said, who do you think is giving and who do you think is getting? You don't need to be a social theorist to know that most people would assume that sex is something that women will give and that men will want to get. And this is the foundation of most of our movies, thrillers, horror movies, before you even get into sort of love and romance or pornography, for example. It's a dynamic still scarred by this binary relationship of predator and prey. So if that's how heterosexuality is defined, then of course masculinity is represented by dominance. And masculinity is intimately wedded to violence and capacity to violence, which then goes back to physical strength, force, bodily presence, ability to dominate. Then within a patriarchal culture, there's the notion that heterosexuality protects women from other predatory men. So you need to catch and get a strong one that will look after you and protect you from all the other men out there. That's still a deep-seated narrative. It's laughable because it's so backwards, and yet it's still very deep-rooted, I think, in society and in representations of heterosexuality. And going back to your point, the point that came from the audience, tall men do better, tall women do not. So in terms of representation in positions of power, how much they earn, women who are within the average height or shorter do better. So that's gross. What are we saying? Women are supposed to be short and weak and not take up much space and tiny, and men are supposed to be big and dominant. I mean, God, it's just like, it's so backwards. And these things that are social fractures that are out there that we've created, of course, they don't just exist in the pages of academic books because, as the person said from the audience, they are playing out in how much you earn, whether you earn anything at all, whether you get promoted or not, whether you can go into certain careers or not, whether you'll be recognized or not. So they have serious repercussions.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a lot of other questions and we've got, 15, 20 minutes. So I will try and keep us brief.
I've heard that the most popular dating apps, a lot of them sort of basically the way they work is that they sort of you almost have like a hidden rank or rating inside it, and you're shown people of a similar level of attractiveness. And I was thinking, do you think that sort of system, which sort of ranks people in a level of attractiveness to the general population, which is obviously going to be based on very like societal beauty standards, means that people who don't fit those standards, who in the past might have looked for communities where they and looked for people that who were attracted to them and where they were considered attractive, are now being sort of pushed to the sidelines, not being able to find like romantic attraction, and in extreme circumstances sort of being pushed into stuff like incel movements. Do you think that's a consequence of dating? Do you think that's a consequence of dating apps? And if so, like what would you change?
Okay, so that's a good question. So the worry seems to be about a kind of algorithmic injustice, maybe linking to society. So this goes back to the issue of Tom's startup with £1 million. How do we address this practically? I mean, in building new forms of technology, is it something that the dating apps themselves are causing, or are they just reflecting these social attitudes? Where do we even begin?
Yeah, I think it's kind of quite difficult on the sort of the dating apps where there has been reports. I mean, I haven't seen any academic studies on this, but I've seen kind of popular reporting about apps like Tinder in particular, which have a sort of forms of kind of facial recognition where they look at your features. How symmetrical is your face? You know, where are your eyes? As well as just going on, how many people swipe on you. And I think, going back to some of the things that I said in the talk earlier, that there are certainly sort of progressive computer scientists out there who are really interested in these questions of, okay, well, how do we match people? What's Tinder's business model in that respect? They want to give some people some matches, and they want to give people some dates so that people feel like it's worthwhile. But do they have long-term interests in creating sustainable long-term relationships? Indeed, if that's what people want from an app like Tinder, well, probably in terms of their business model, maybe not, right? Because they need to, keep people coming back in the long run. So I think, at least in terms of what these kind of computer scientists are thinking about, they're thinking about how do we design an app which might make people think again about groups that they would otherwise have overlooked. And how do you do that in a way which isn't just kind of blatant manipulation, which isn't misleading people, which isn't kind of immoral in various ways by presenting people in ways that they're not. But they think they want to think about these things in terms of ensuring that people are kind of open. And if it's the case that, you get a 7.4 ranking, and Tinder is only showing you people who are kind of 8s or 7s, and it knows, or it thinks it knows that well, you're never going to go for what it ranks as a 4 based on its dubious kind of ranking system, then that might be a problem. As to whether this is kind of fueling kind of incel kind of violence, I mean, lots of men kind of report real problems. At least, the way in which these kind of dating apps work, it seems to work very well for a few promiscuous men and very badly for the kind of vast majority of kind of men. I mean, that's at least the anecdotal kind of reports here. But as to whether that sort of leads to incel violence, I mean, the thing with incel violence and incel sort of identity and community, though, is often that this is, these are not necessarily people who are just deemed unattractive in and of itself. It's often because they're kind of weirdo misogynists who hate women and have a whole bunch of other problems. It's not necessarily the fact that some algorithm has seen their face or people have not immediately matched that's their problem. And I think their kind of fixation on what Elliot Rodger, the kind of Isla Vista killing guy, he was, talks about like hot blonde sluts and like kind of fuckable women and all this kind of language where he had a particular idea of, who was the most desirable woman, and the fact that he couldn't get those sorts of women to be interested in him because he was a kind of shut-in weirdo. The problem there isn't, necessarily the dating apps. It's all of this kind of other views and other sort of attitudes towards kind of women and the social world and so on. So in that sense, I don't think incels are just a product of some of these dynamics on the apps.
And just quickly on that, I think that goes back to the sort of ideas about entitlement. I mean, with Elliot Rodgers, he wasn't conventionally unattractive. He also was highly educated. He came from quite a wealthy background. He had a lot of material things and access to cultural things that he could have enjoyed with other people, that he could have shown off about, to other men and to women. It seems with him, and when you read, if you ever would want to, his biography / manifesto, that he had everything going for him in a lot of ways. But he just sort of sat there and expected it all to come to him. He didn't go on dating apps. He didn't make friends. He didn't go out. He didn't socialise. But he raged against... There was quite a lot of racialised discourse in there as well. But he raged against men he saw supposedly just getting and possessing these women supposedly out of nowhere without doing anything or any kind of social interaction at all. The entitled idea that women are some sort of commodity that should be given to you or presented to you on a plate as things, as objects to get, to have, to win, to possess, rather than other human beings that you might form a relationship or an attraction to. And of course, a lot of the focus on incels as well, I think, does kind of return to this kind of aggrandizement or prioritization of masculinity and of men as a group. So girls and young women too are facing economic insecurity, challenges about rites of passage, youth transitions into adulthood, how they're represented in the media. Young women too are facing all of these things. There's girls and young women out there that feel uncertain when dating, that feel they can't form relationships. But society has this. But when we think about those people and those troubles, we all envisage mainly a young white man sat at his computer. We have this very particular image of what struggle looks like. And again, I think we need to step back and question that, because girls and women struggle too. They don't tend to go out and become mass shooters or rape people. So consequently, they don't get any of the social attention. They don't get any of this discourse or policies or concerns about how we can improve things for them. But they are struggling with the same things too.
Okay. We're going to try and get through all of you.
I just want to go back to something you were saying about how men are broadly attracted to, little women who'll raise their children and bake them bread, and women are broadly attracted to tall, strong men who'll earn money. An argument against that I always hear is, that's just evolution. That's, we don't have any control over that. That's an evolutionary desire. What are you supposed to do about that? And I always struggle to know how to respond to that, because I would immediately think, I totally disagree with that. It's not just an evolutionary trait. We can change that, but I kind of struggle to know how to respond. So how would you respond to that criticism?
We can't kind of have it both ways, can't we? So we can't sort of say that our human society now is evolved, that we can use machinery and technology and AI, and we've managed to conquer nature and create all these things to make our lives better. And then on the other hand go, but we're just monkeys really, we're just apes. And never mind that the evolutionary biologists will only ever pick kind of certain species of animals that reinforce the kind of dynamic that you're talking about, when actually there's huge variety in species, and they could also pick examples that contradict those. But it is a bit grim to kind of say that in this society that women should still need protection from the sort of baying wolves, and that all you can do to kind of get by as a woman in this society is to choose a man that's going to protect you from the baying wolves. There's also no biological reason why men can't nurture and care for children. So childbirth may be something that women do, but child rearing and child nurturing is something that men could and should do too. And I think changing those understandings about caring roles is really important in society as well. But of course, we're seeing a huge resurgence of, the so-called trad wife movement from many different political persuasions. And I think there's a seduction in a rose-tinted idea of concrete gender roles that never existed at any point in history either. So there never really was a time for the majority where a man's wage could sustain an entire household, for example. Working class women always had to work, whether they did that in the home or they did that outside the home. So it's always a sort of totemic kind of mythic idea anyway that isn't reality. But I think at times of economic and climate insecurity and sort of existential crisis, people like to return to this seductive idea of gender roles, which is seen as something we can control. We can't control all these other things, but we can go back to the idea of home life, and we can go back to this supposedly mythic idea where men were men and women were women, and we'll build out from the family, and we'll build this more kind of stable society. But if we're this advanced, human species, and we can have people living up on the International Space Station right now, being sustained, surely it is just a bit backwards to say that women need to have men to sustain them and to depend upon. There's no biological grounding for that. And there's certainly, and if we look at the damage as well, how is it the place where women and children are most at risk of serious violence or death is in their own homes, from men that they know, from men that they're supposed to be able to trust the most, from men that are supposedly able to love them. What is the evolutionary argument for that? What is nature doing in that? What could possibly sustain the human species to normalize the levels of violence and abuse that are perpetrated by men against women? That nature wouldn't do that. There can be no reason in nature for that. And in fact, nature tries to survive. And what you find in a lot of animal studies is that have been, I don't approve of them for many reasons, but what they show is that if there's a situation around scarcity or for necessity, males will raise young. Of course, that's what nature would be, raising and caring for and nurturing according to need. I think that surely is the most evolutionary answer.
So let's take another question.
Thank you. Tom, during your talk, I was taken by your analogy of discrimination in the dating marketplace and discrimination in the employment marketplace. And I was hoping you could help me tease it out a little more. So in the job marketplace, I know how to understand the kind of claim that someone who's discriminated against is making against a potential employer. They're saying, I have a demand against you. You should have hired me because I'm the most qualified. I don't know how to spell that out in the dating marketplace. I don't know who the you is. You should have done, I presumably dated me because I am the blank, the most attractive, the prettiest, the what have you, right? So I don't know how to fill out the nature of the demand and who's on the other side of it. It might be that is the dating apps that we want to look to because that's central to your research. But I can see the dating apps just saying, hey, look, we're just the channels of the desires of our customers, right? Don't shoot the messenger. If you don't have a complaint against the user, how can you have a complaint against us? Because we're just reflecting the user. Thank you.
Yeah, so good. So this was an example from Sonu Bedi, the philosopher, who's very taken by this kind of analogy between kind of dating and what he sees as opportunities for romantic intimacy and the opportunities in the workplace. So I agree that there's maybe something that doesn't quite sort of work there. And so I don't necessarily want to sort of endorse that precisely because dating and relationships aren't this kind of resource. But it does make me think of another philosopher, Elizabeth Emmons, who tries to think about these things in terms of some of the legal processes that go on around accommodation. So she's interested in this case of potential forms of intimate discrimination in the disability case. So she says, okay, well, let's say, it's not a perfect analogy, but let's say that I think about the role of my partner in a relationship in the same way as I might think of a job role. What are my requirements? What are the things that people have to do? And she says, well, if you kind of if you spell those out and you're very explicit about them, if you say, I want someone with a good personality, but perhaps I want someone who I can be physically intimate with in these ways, then you will find that if you're very exacting about those things in your relationship, like you might be in a job ad, that suddenly there are a lot more people who are available because there are things that can be done to facilitate forms of physical intimacy which you might not immediately think of with certain forms of physical disability. There might be other aspects of how people think about self-presentation, which certain people with particular physical or psychological disabilities might not be totally ruled out there. So she wants to deepen this by looking at things like the law on discriminations, or what reasonable accommodations could be made for someone in this thing. Again, as I say, a relationship, being someone's partner isn't a job. They have different places in society. There are all sorts of ways in which the analogy doesn't work. But at least there are some attempts to use some of the strategies that we use to push back against discrimination in one sphere, to at least to reframe our thoughts and our psychology about desire in the other sphere. Whether that's convincing, I don't know, but that's how it's been tried, at least.
Okay, thank you. There are lots of questions around, so does someone want to pass the microphone over there?
I just want to ask, I was thinking during the break, so I haven't really thought about it that well, but what if there are certain truths you can't reconcile? So I have a friend, she's a very successful scientist. So there was a guy who says, oh, you work at a workplace. What does your husband let you? So she was very offended. At the same time, she was one time saying, I wish I had a very strong man, makes money, all this stuff you were saying. So she has both desires. She wants to stay home and wants to work and be independent. So I'm saying that this is not just a hair. What if this exists in society in general, and that both aspects are actually truth, that there's nothing wrong? And when you have all these options, all these different contradictory desires, you just don't really know what to do. So you're more like, you're even unhappier than you would have been either way. So yeah, what would you do with this kind of truth that you can't reconcile at all? So yeah.
Well, we could say that if oppression was good for people, there'd be something to say for it. We're all shaped by these ideas, and of course, people are wrestling with those things and feeling those pressures, and may feel them genuinely too, as genuine desires. And I think we could say that there might be nothing wrong with that in a country where there wasn't around a 17% gender pay gap, in a country where people were supported with equal maternity and paternity leave to raise children. If you had a more egalitarian grounding, then you could maybe just look at these things as individual preferences or individual desires that people should be free to explore and pursue, of course. But we're not coming from that neutral standpoint. So it is always inherently political if women feel the need to be with a man for protection, financial, other types of security. That is inherently political because we live in a sexist world where women don't enjoy safety and economic security at the levels that men as a group do. Not to say all men do individually either, but as a group, and women as a group, there are those inequalities. If you didn't have the inequalities, as I say, then, well, maybe it's your individual preference. Crack on. But as long as we live in a world with pay gaps and with unequal access to support with childcare and leave to raise children, then I do think it's problematic and it is political. And of course now we're having this conversation about, the role of men in society, about fatherhood, about caring roles, and a lot of men are coming out into the public sphere and saying, well, we live in this capitalist world where supposedly I'm able to choose however I want to live. Choice is like some kind of religion in this society. I should be able to choose, it's my choice, and yet I can't choose to take time off work or to have paid leave to raise my child if I want to, and my female partner go back to work. We don't have that choice. And a lot of men increasingly are coming out and saying they might like it. So I think people are being held back in lots of ways by these real pressures and also by the stereotypes that remain. Women are seen in positions of power that they never were before. Women are earning more than they ever were before, and they're in formal employment in ways that they weren't before. So on paper, a lot of things have changed. They haven't gone far enough in terms of pay and leave. But also, I think in terms of people's psyches, they haven't changed far enough either. If we've still got men who are dying by suicide, for example, because they cannot entertain the idea of telling their wife that they've lost their job, been made redundant, gone bankrupt, going to lose the house, going to lose the business, that is such a fundamental failure in their eyes of their masculine role that they would rather die than tell their female partner about that, then we have a problem with gender stereotyping and gender norms. That it might not be reflected on paper, but it's still very strong in our psyches. So it's going to have an effect on people.
Okay. So we have time for 2 more questions. Keep them brief though, please.
Hello. Well, you said to keep it brief. I'm hoping that this is kind of brief. But as someone who has never used a dating app and does not intend on ever using a dating app, do you think that we're at the point of no return and that the way that we experience attraction now is really tied to like our phones and the apps that we use? Do you think that in some way that has fundamentally changed the way that people experience attraction? Because sometimes I feel like that, but it might just be a me thing that I've noticed, if that makes sense.
I think that probably is true, or at least it's becoming increasingly true. There's some really interesting work by the sort of critical theorist and sociologist Eva Illouz about this, where she's interested in, how is desire kind of experienced on sort of dating apps? And she talks about this kind of abulic desire. So these kind of forms of kind of desire when you have this whole kind of panoply of kind of choices that, like, the whole world is open to you, in some sense, at least for kind of some users of these apps. But then they can't kind of fix on one person. So they're constantly looking for the next thing. And the knowledge that in your pocket is this phone where, if this date's not going very well, or, if you're having a bump in your relationship after, a month or 2 months or 3 months, you always have this kind of resource available to you, which you can do in secret. It doesn't require going to a pub or a club. It's something that you can do at any time. I think changes the kind of the narrative of desire that people have. And I think in that respect, it might be harder to form strong commitments because there's always that sense, maybe there's something better out there. And of course, that's the case for all relationships, but the opportunity cost of doing that is much, much lower if you've got this thing in your pocket all the time that can do it. I think that doesn't go for everyone's kind of psychological world, but I think that is a dynamic which is becoming more and more clear and might even be sort of infecting the psychologies of people who don't use sort of dating apps. They're just used to encountering these forms of sociality out there in the world. It's become more normalized that this is how people will treat relationships and desire, and they begin to internalize that themselves. So I think not even you are safe.
Okay, so that was a pessimistic note. We've got one more question, so it falls upon you to end on an optimistic note.
I can't promise that, unfortunately. This question's about modern dating and capitalism. So how much of modern dating is informed by capitalist structures? The way I've experienced Tinder, Hinge, etc., and social media generally is about how rich you can appear, how financially ambitious you are, future prospects, how you can show off, which to me seems inherently patriarchal as well. Linked to that, there's also this craze for American-style ambitious capitalism. So is modern dating too far commodified, too capitalist, and is dating too expensive, too patriarchal?
So in short, I think yes, that is the case. So I mean, you might think here about, we've talked a lot about sort of dating apps, and you think about what's the kind of financial, kind of incentives of the companies sort of involved here in kind of shaping the landscape in which kind of people meet. And what incentives do they have for relationships to fail, for them precisely to fail? But I mean, you think about these things like, the wider structure of how, dating and love is entwined with capitalism, all the way back, right? So all the way back to the early modern period. So again, there's a really interesting discussions in Eva Illouz about, think about Jane Austen, right? Like, oh, you know, these kind of classic love stories which kind of inform how we think about desire, how we think about kind of sexuality and love. In the background of that, I mean, what do you find? It's all about, oh, his income is, £5,000 a year, and how many acres does he have, and who's seen as desirable and not on that basis. So that's kind of a long-standing thing that's there. And also in the kind of Jane Austen, there are these links to kind of colonialism and slavery as well. So how did you get this big manor with these, with these kind of X number of kind of acres as well? So I don't think that's a particularly very kind of recent sort of aspect of the intertwining of kind of capitalism and desire, but it's been there for a long time. And it might not just be capitalism; it might just be the kind of the economic foundations of who's seen as a good kind of prospect or not. And again, I mean, seen through this kind of gendered lens. I mean, it might be interesting to what extent these things are now being decoupled. If kind of women are feeling that they're being judged as kind of economic kind of prospects as well, in and of themselves in terms of their earning power, as opposed to what wealth their families can bring to an economic kind of union. So that might be a little bit more of a change in these dynamics, but these dynamics are long-standing, and I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon, unfortunately.
Okay, so that was a perfectly pessimistic end to what has been a really enjoyable evening. Nice.